As president, Hoover called for volunteerism backed up by government programs and support. He worked on behalf of child welfare, conservation, civil liberties, and public education, and he was a strong advocate of the rights of Native Americans.
I have no dread of the ordinary work of the presidency. What I do fear is the exaggerated idea that people have conceived of me. They have a conviction that I am a sort of Superman, that no problem is beyond my capacity. If some unprecedented calamity should come upon the nation, I would be sacrificed to the unreasoning disappointment of a people who expected too much.
Just 7 months into his presidency, that national calamity occurred with the crash of the stock market. And for the first time in his life, Hoover was faced with a force over which he had no control.
When one watches the response in Hoover's time to the Great Depression as it actually developed, one realizes that people were at sea, intellectually at sea. Something was happening that had not happened before. He was totally unprepared for what happened.
Hoover's concept of a public-private partnership was inadequate to the emergency. Local governments could not cope with the immensity of the crisis, and private volunteerism, contrary to his expectations, failed to materialize. On top of this, the president himself was changing. Unaccustomed to failure or to negative publicity, Hoover became strangely passive and distant during the Great Depression. And when the millionaire president made the public statement that nobody in the country is actually starving, the American people turned against him. In time, his very name began to spell hate and hunger to millions. Poverty-stricken shanty towns became known as Hoovervilles. Newspapers that homeless men slept under were called Hoover blankets. And broken-down vehicles pulled by mules, an increasingly common sight, were dubbed Hoover wagons. Seeing the president as uncaring and out of touch with reality, the country began to look for a more compassionate political leader.
As the Depression deepened, more and more members of the American public changed their notion of what they wanted in the presidency. This happens all the time in America. The great engineer looked very authoritative in 1929. By 1931, he looked like the quintessential stuffed shirt. By 1932, he looked positively unfriendly, uncaring. High starched collars, a jowly face above the collar. Compare that with Franklin Roosevelt's public presentation in the 1932 election. He projected warmth, enthusiasm, concern, and caring. And the contrast was extraordinary.
In the final year of his presidency, Hoover initiated a series of important federal measures to provide food for hungry Americans and to shore up the banking system. But to his critics, it all seemed too little, too late. Just 14 weeks before the national election, thousands of unemployed veterans descended upon Washington with their wives and children, seeking an early payment of a war bonus. When the Senate failed to pass such a bill, the group calling itself the Bonus Army staged what it called a death march around the Capitol building. Congressmen trapped inside and fearing for their lives had to escape through subterranean tunnels. When a riot erupted and the protesters turned toward the White House, President Hoover authorized the U.S. Army to intervene. With their temporary huts set on fire, the protesters were run out of the city. Refugees, they complained, from a heartless government. When Franklin Roosevelt heard of the rout, he said, "This will elect me."
Many Democratic speakers implied that I had murdered veterans on the streets of Washington. Democracy is not a polite employer. The only way out of elective office is to get sick or die or get kicked out.
A bitter Herbert Hoover never got over his crushing defeat that year. After leaving office, he did what he had done at regular intervals all his life. He went fishing. In different times, he might have been one of our most successful presidents. But even 3 decades later, in the 1960s, the old man still could not escape from the indictment of a failed presidency. Even so, as he showed in his last televised interview, Hoover's faith in America, like fishing, never dimmed.
There have been presidents like Grover Cleveland and myself who've been fishermen from boyhood. We got the habit. Perhaps without immodesty, I can claim to have had some experience in what the word America means. Within the soul of America is freedom of mind and spirit. Perhaps it's not perfect, but it is more full of its realization here than in any other place in the world.